Number 1. John Christie. In the years following the Second World War, London was a city rebuilding itself from devastation. Bombed streets were slowly being repaired, families were returning to ordinary routines, and life in many neighborhoods began to feel stable again. But hidden behind the walls of a modest apartment building in the Notting Hill district was a man whose quiet appearance concealed a terrifying secret. His name was John Christie, and the crimes he committed would eventually expose one of the most disturbing murder cases in British history. Christie lived at 10 Rillington Place, a narrow 3-story house divided into small apartments. The street looked like many other working-class streets in London during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The buildings were worn from years of wartime hardship, and the residents were mostly laborers, families, and individuals trying to rebuild their lives after years of conflict. To his neighbors, Christie appeared unremarkable. He was a thin, quiet man who spoke softly and rarely attracted attention. Some residents even believed he had medical knowledge, because he occasionally claimed to have worked as a police officer or hospital assistant. In a community where people often relied on neighbors for help, Christie's calm demeanor allowed him to blend easily into daily life. But the reality was far darker. John Christie had been born in 1899 in Halifax, England. His early life was troubled, marked by instability and difficulty maintaining relationships. As a young man, he struggled with employment and was involved in several minor crimes. During the 1920s and 1930s, he was convicted of theft and violence, spending time in prison. Despite this criminal history, Christie managed to build the appearance of a normal life. He married a woman named Ethel and eventually moved with her to London. By the 1940s, the couple had settled into the ground-floor apartment at 10 Rillington Place. For several years, nothing seemed unusual about their lives. Yet Christie carried violent fantasies that would eventually turn deadly. The first confirmed murder occurred in 1943 during the height of the war. At the time, London was still enduring air raids and widespread chaos. People disappeared frequently during bombings and evacuations, making it easier for certain crimes to go unnoticed. Christie met a woman named Ruth West, an Austrian immigrant who had moved to Britain seeking safety from the turmoil spreading across Europe. Using his usual quiet charm, Christie invited her to his home. Once she arrived, he attacked and strangled her. He then buried her body in the garden behind the building. The war continued, and the disappearance attracted little attention. Years passed before Christie killed again. In 1948, a young couple named Timothy Evans and Beryl Evans moved into the apartment above Christie's. They were struggling financially and had a young daughter. The small rooms of the building meant neighbors often heard each other through the thin walls, and Christie gradually became acquainted with the family. When Beryl discovered she was pregnant again, the couple faced a difficult situation. Abortion was illegal in Britain at the time, and they feared they could not afford another child. Christie presented himself as someone who could help. He claimed to have medical training and told the couple he knew how to perform a safe abortion. Desperate and trusting their neighbor, Beryl agreed, but Christie's offer was a trap. Instead of performing any medical procedure, he strangled her in his apartment. He then hid her body within the building. In a shocking twist, the crime would lead to one of the most controversial miscarriages of justice in British legal history. Timothy Evans initially believed his wife had died accidentally during the procedure. Confused and frightened, he eventually went to police and told them different versions of the story. During questioning, he made statements that investigators interpreted as a confession. In 1950, Timothy Evans was convicted of murdering his wife and daughter. Despite maintaining that he had not committed the crimes, he was executed by hanging. At the time, authorities believed the case was solved, but the truth remained hidden within the walls of 10 Rillington Place. Over the next several years, Christie continued living quietly in the same building. In 1952 and 1953, he began killing again. One by one, women entered his apartment and never left alive. Christie used a similar method each time. He would lure victims into his home, often promising companionship or assistance. Once they were inside, he used gas to render them unconscious before strangling them. He hid the bodies in various places throughout the apartment, behind walls, beneath floorboards, and inside cupboards. The killings continued until the cramped rooms of his home contained multiple victims concealed within them. By early 1953, Christie's own life was beginning to unravel. His wife Ethel discovered some of the disturbing things he had been doing, and he ultimately killed her as well. After murdering his wife, Christie abandoned the apartment and fled London. but his crimes were about to be discovered. Soon after he left, new tenants moved into the building. While renovating parts of the apartment, they made a horrifying discovery. Hidden behind a kitchen wall were human remains. Police were immediately called to the scene. As investigators searched the building more thoroughly, they uncovered additional bodies concealed in various parts of the property. The small house at 10 Rillington Place suddenly became one of the most shocking crime scenes in British history. Authorities quickly realized that the murders had occurred over several years, but an even more disturbing realization soon followed. The killings took place in the same building where Timothy Evans had once lived, the man who had already been executed for murder. Investigators began reconsidering the earlier case. It soon became clear that Evans might have been innocent. Police launched a nationwide search for John Christie, who had vanished shortly before the bodies were discovered. Newspapers across Britain published his photograph, warning the public that he was extremely dangerous. For several weeks Christie managed to evade capture, but on March 31, 1953, he was finally recognized and arrested on the banks of the River Thames. During interrogation, Christie confessed to multiple murders. His calm and detached descriptions of the crimes stunned investigators. He admitted killing several women and described how he had concealed their bodies inside the apartment. The full extent of his crimes shocked the public. Christie was eventually charged with murder and brought to trial later that year. The courtroom proceedings attracted enormous attention from across Britain. Evidence presented during the trial confirmed that he had been responsible for several killings at 10 Rillington Place, but perhaps the most troubling aspect of the case was its connection to the execution of Timothy Evans. Many people now believed Evans had been wrongly convicted. In 1953, the court found John Christie guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death and executed by hanging in July of that same year. The case left a lasting impact on British society. Public outrage over the possibility that an innocent man had been executed eventually led to a re-examination of the Evans case. Years later, Timothy Evans received a posthumous pardon, and the tragedy became a major factor in the eventual abolition of the death penalty in the United Kingdom. The building at 10 Rillington Place became infamous. It was eventually demolished, and the street itself was renamed in an attempt to erase the memory of the crimes that had taken place there. But the story of John Christie remains one of the most disturbing chapters in British criminal history. Behind the quiet appearance of a modest apartment building lived a man capable of unimaginable violence. For years he hid his crimes in plain sight, deceiving neighbors and authorities alike. And in one of the darkest twists of justice, his actions led to the execution of another man before the truth was finally uncovered. Today, the name John Christie stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous killers are the ones who appear the most ordinary, living quietly among their neighbors, while hiding horrors behind closed doors. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Ian Brady. In the early 1960s, the city of Manchester was filled with the energy of a changing Britain. Music, fashion, and youth culture were transforming the atmosphere of the country. Teenagers gathered in cafes, dance halls, and cinemas, enjoying freedoms that previous generations had never experienced. But during those same years, a series of disappearances began unfolding that would eventually reveal one of the most horrifying crimes in British history. At the center of the case was Ian Brady, a man whose cold and calculated cruelty would shock the entire nation. Alongside his accomplice Myra Hindley, Brady carried out a series of murders that became known as the Moors murders, crimes that would haunt the United Kingdom for decades. Ian Brady was born in 1938 in Glasgow, Scotland. His early childhood was difficult. Raised primarily by foster parents, Brady grew up feeling disconnected from the world around him. Even as a teenager, he showed signs of troubling behavior. He developed an intense fascination with violence and crime, spending hours reading about infamous criminals and studying disturbing literature. As he entered adulthood, Brady moved to Manchester, where he eventually found work as a clerk in a chemical company. It was there, in 1961, that he met Myra Hindley. Hindley was several years younger and initially appeared very different from Brady. She was outgoing, sociable, and seemed eager to build a normal life. But Brady quickly began influencing her. Their relationship developed rapidly, and over time he exposed her to the dark obsessions that dominated his thinking. Brady introduced Hindley to violent literature, extreme philosophies, and discussions about power and control. Gradually, her personality began to change. Friends and co-workers later said that she seemed to become colder, more distant, and increasingly devoted to Brady's worldview. Together, the pair began forming a plan that would eventually lead to unimaginable crimes. Their method relied on manipulation and deception. The victims they targeted were children and teenagers, who could easily be approached in public places without raising immediate suspicion. Often, Hindley played a crucial role in gaining the victims' trust. Her appearance as a young woman made it easier for them to approach children without creating fear. The murders began in 1963. One evening, a 16-year-old girl named Pauline Red disappeared while walking to a dance in Manchester. She had been seen talking to a couple driving a car, but after that moment, she vanished without a trace. Her family searched desperately for answers, but there were none. Police launched an investigation, yet the case quickly went cold. No clear evidence pointed to a suspect, and the disappearance remained an unsolved mystery. A year later, in 1964, another child vanished. This time it was John Kilbride, a 12-year-old boy who had been walking through a local market area. Witnesses remembered seeing him speaking with a couple who asked for help, loading something into a car. That couple was Brady and Hindley. Like their previous victim, the boy disappeared. The pattern continued in 1965, when 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey vanished after visiting a fairground during the Christmas season. The festive atmosphere of the carnival made the disappearance even more shocking. Investigators worked tirelessly to find the child, but the clues were scarce. What police did not yet know was that Brady and Hindley had taken the victims to a remote area known as Saddleworth Moor, a vast and windswept stretch of land outside Manchester. The moor was isolated and difficult to navigate. Its empty hills and boggy ground made it the perfect place for someone trying to hide evidence. The killers buried several victims there, believing the remote landscape would keep their crimes hidden forever. But eventually their careful plan began to unravel. In October 1965, Brady and Hindley targeted another victim, 17-year-old Edward Evans. They lured him to their home in Manchester under the pretense of conversation. But this time, someone else was present. Brady's brother-in-law, David Smith, was visiting the house that night. Smith had no idea what was about to happen. While he waited in another room, Brady attacked Evans with an axe. The violence of the assault horrified Smith, who suddenly realized he was witnessing a murder. Afterward, Brady calmly told him that he had killed before and planned to kill again. Smith was terrified but managed to leave the house. Instead of remaining silent, he went directly to the police. His testimony triggered a massive investigation. Officers quickly searched Brady and Hindley's home and discovered evidence linking them to multiple murders. Among the most disturbing discoveries was an audio recording connected to one of the victims, which confirmed the brutality of the crimes. Both Brady and Hindley were arrested. As detectives continued searching for evidence, they began exploring the remote landscape of Saddleworth Moor. What they eventually uncovered there confirmed the worst fears of investigators and families alike. Buried beneath the cold soil were the remains of several victims. The discovery horrified the nation. News reports describing the crime spread rapidly across Britain. The image of the barren moor became permanently associated with the tragedy. In 1966, the trial of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley began. It quickly became one of the most sensational criminal trials in British history. The courtroom was filled with journalists, police officers, and grieving families seeking answers. Evidence presented during the trial revealed the calculated nature of the murders. Brady was described as the driving force behind the crimes. But the court also heard how Hindley had actively participated in luring victims and assisting in the killings. The disturbing details shocked the public. For many people, the idea that a young couple could commit such horrific acts together seemed almost impossible to comprehend. At the conclusion of the trial, both Brady and Hindley were found guilty of multiple murders. Because Britain had recently abolished the death penalty for certain crimes, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. But the story did not end there. For decades after the trial, investigators continued searching Saddleworth Moor, in hopes of finding the remains of additional victims believed to have been buried there. The landscape became a symbol of the crimes, a bleak reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded during those years. Ian Brady spent the rest of his life in prison, becoming one of the most infamous inmates in British history. He showed little remorse for his actions, and often expressed disturbing views during interviews and legal appeals. He remained imprisoned until his death in 2017. The Moors murders left a lasting scar on British society. Parents became far more cautious about allowing children to travel alone. The case also changed the way police handled missing persons investigations, especially when children were involved. Even today, the names of the victims are remembered with sadness across the United Kingdom. The crimes committed by Brady and Myra Hindley were not just acts of violence, they were a betrayal of trust that shocked an entire nation. And the lonely hills of Saddleworth Moor remain a silent witness to one of the darkest chapters in British criminal history. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 3. Dennis Nilsen. In the early 1980s, London was a city caught between modern progress and lingering shadows of its post-war past. Streets were alive with commuters, neon lights, and a vibrant nightlife. Yet in the quiet residential district of Muswell Hill, a man was living among neighbors who had no idea that behind his front door, unspeakable crimes were being committed. That man was Dennis Nilsen, a figure whose actions would make him one of the most infamous serial killers in British history. Nilsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. From an early age, he experienced a mix of neglect and social isolation. He was described by teachers and neighbors as a withdrawn, peculiar child who struggled to form connections with peers. As he grew older, Nilsen became increasingly obsessed with death and solitude, reading extensively about corpses and funeral practices. These interests, while morbid, went largely unnoticed by those around him, allowing him to cultivate a quiet, unassuming persona. After completing basic education, Nilsen attempted a military career but was discharged after a short period. He later held various jobs, including working for the civil service in London, a position that gave him stability but also prolonged his solitary life. Living alone for long periods, he developed routines that allowed him to move through life unnoticed, all while nurturing the dark compulsions that would later define him. By the late 1970s, Nilsen had moved into a top-floor flat at Alderton Gardens, Muswell Hill, and then later to Melbury Road. It was in these apartments that he would commit the murders that eventually terrified London. His victims were primarily young men, many of whom were vulnerable, socially marginalized, or transient individuals who might not be immediately missed. The murders began around 1978. Nilsen would meet men in pubs or on the streets, often using charm and feigned companionship to lure them to his flat. Once inside, he would kill them, typically by strangulation or drowning, methods that allowed him to maintain control and minimize noise. Following the murders, Nilsen displayed an unusual and chilling ritual. He would preserve parts of the bodies, dismember them, and in some cases, keep remains for months. He would bathe with the corpses, sometimes sitting with them as if they were still alive, a practice that revealed the depths of his psychological disturbance. His killing spree was methodical, and for several years, Nilsen was able to avoid detection. He meticulously cleaned his apartment after each murder, disposing of remains in drains or secluded areas when possible. Neighbors occasionally noticed unpleasant odors or unusual activity, but largely attributed it to other causes, such as plumbing issues or heating problems, never suspecting the presence of multiple victims hidden within the walls of the building. In 1983, Nilsen's crimes began to unravel due to an unexpected event. A blocked drain outside his flat led a plumber to discover human remains, which were traced back to the flat. The police investigation quickly escalated as detectives examined the apartment and found more remains, along with diaries and personal notes that chronicled Nilsen's murders and interactions with his victims. The level of organization and cold calculation evident in these documents horrified investigators. When interrogated, Nilsen confessed to multiple murders. He described, in detail, the luring, killing, and disposal of his victims. Unlike some killers who attempted to conceal their actions or express remorse, Nilsen often spoke openly, almost clinically, about the methods he employed. He claimed that his actions were driven by an intense desire for control and companionship, rather than traditional motives such as robbery or anger. The trial that followed captivated the United Kingdom. Nilsen was charged with 6 murders and 2 attempted murders, but during the proceedings, evidence suggested he might have been responsible for as many as 15 killings. Forensic experts described the state of the apartment as one of the most gruesome crime scenes ever documented in London, noting the careful but macabre organization of human remains. Throughout the trial, psychological examinations revealed a complex portrait of Nilsen. He suffered from severe personality disorders, including obsessive tendencies and deep-seated social and sexual dysfunction. He displayed necrophilic behavior, combining sexual compulsion with violent control. Yet he was also intelligent, articulate, and capable of maintaining a convincing facade of normalcy, traits that had allowed him to avoid suspicion for years. In November 1983, Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he'd never be released. He spent the rest of his life in various high-security prisons, remaining a subject of study for criminologists and psychologists interested in the intersection of social isolation, personality disorders, and serial killing behavior. The case of Dennis Nilsen left a profound impact on British society. It highlighted the dangers faced by marginalized populations, particularly homeless or transient individuals who were often overlooked by law enforcement. The investigation also prompted police to review practices related to missing persons, transient communities, and the monitoring of individuals living in isolation who might pose a threat. Even decades later, Nilsen's crimes continued to fascinate and horrify. Documentaries, books, and academic studies examine the eerie combination of loneliness, control, and predatory behavior that defined his murders. His flat at Melbury Road has long been remembered in media accounts as a place where life and death intersected in the most horrifying ways, a grim monument to one of the United Kingdom's most notorious serial killers. For historians and criminologists, the Nilsen case remains a chilling reminder that outward normalcy can mask unimaginable depravity, and that predatory minds often operate unnoticed until a single mistake or accident exposes years of secret atrocities. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 4. Peter Sutcliffe. Between 1975 and 1980, the industrial towns and cities of West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester were gripped by a climate of fear. Women walked cautiously through streets, often avoiding quiet areas or traveling in groups. Shops and bars displayed warnings, and the police were under intense pressure as a killer moved with terrifying freedom. This killer was Peter Sutcliffe, a man whose brutal attacks and methodical planning made him one of the most notorious figures in British criminal history. Peter Sutcliffe was born in 1946 in Bingley, West Yorkshire. His childhood was relatively ordinary, but he developed an early fascination with violence and pornography, particularly material featuring domination and control. As a young adult, Sutcliffe worked in various jobs, including truck driving, which gave him mobility and an excuse to travel across northern England. Friends described him as polite, but socially awkward, with occasional temper flare-ups and an obsession with sex and authority. The first known attack attributed to Sutcliffe occurred in October 1975, when a 28-year-old woman was assaulted on a dark street in West Yorkshire. Over the following months, a series of attacks escalated in both frequency and brutality. Sutcliffe targeted women walking alone at night, many of whom were sex workers, but he also attacked others he perceived as morally corrupt or promiscuous. His violence was indiscriminate, and he showed no remorse. Sutcliffe's method of attack was consistent and chilling. He would approach women in isolated areas, often pretending to ask for directions or engaging them in brief conversation. Once his victim was within reach, he would strike with a hammer or knife, sometimes stabbing multiple times and leaving his victims severely wounded or dead. The attacks were random in location and timing, creating widespread panic among communities in West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, and Greater Manchester. What made Sutcliffe particularly terrifying was his ability to evade capture, despite repeated police investigations. Law enforcement agencies faced significant challenges. Victims and witnesses were traumatized. Descriptions varied, and the geographic spread of the attacks made tracking difficult. Mistakes and miscommunications within the police force allowed Sutcliffe to continue his spree for years. He was able to travel freely, often using his truck driving routes to conceal movements between towns. By 1979, Sutcliffe had murdered at least 13 women and severely injured 7 others. His attacks became increasingly violent and unpredictable. Communities were gripped by fear, and women altered their routines dramatically, avoiding streets after dark. The media dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper, a reference to the notorious Jack the Ripper, who had terrorized London nearly a century earlier. The nickname and media coverage intensified public anxiety and created an almost mythic aura around the killer. Despite the scale of the investigation, Sutcliffe remained undetected for years. He occasionally interacted with law enforcement, even submitting to police questioning at one point. His ordinary appearance, polite demeanor, and ability to fabricate plausible stories allowed him to slip through scrutiny. In several instances, witnesses had come close to identifying him, but inconsistencies in reports and the volume of cases delayed decisive action. Sutcliffe's downfall came in January 1981, after he was stopped by police driving a taxi. Officers noticed discrepancies in his identification and behavior, prompting a more thorough investigation. When they searched his vehicle and home, they discovered weapons, clothing, and incriminating items that linked him to the Yorkshire Ripper murders. Confronted with evidence, Sutcliffe confessed to his crimes. He admitted to killing 13 women and attempting to murder 7 others, acknowledging that his attacks were premeditated and deliberate. During the trial, psychological assessments revealed that Sutcliffe exhibited severe personality disorders, including sexual sadism and antisocial tendencies. He rationalized his crimes with delusional religious beliefs, claiming that he was carrying out a divine mission to punish women he considered immoral. Despite attempts to plead diminished responsibility due to mental illness, the jury rejected this defense. In 1981, Sutcliffe was convicted of multiple murders and attempted murders. He received 20 concurrent life sentences, with a recommendation that he'd never be released. For decades, he remained imprisoned, becoming one of the most infamous figures in British criminal history. His case prompted widespread criticism of police practices, particularly the handling of missing persons and the delays in connecting patterns across different jurisdictions. The Yorkshire Ripper case had a profound societal impact. Women's movements and community organizations campaigned for safer streets, increased police presence, and better public awareness. The case became a symbol of both the dangers women faced in urban areas and the failures of law enforcement to act decisively in complex investigations. Even after Sutcliffe's conviction, the legacy of fear and trauma lingered. Survivors of his attacks and the families of his victims carried the psychological scars for life. Media accounts, documentaries, and books continue to explore the case, analyzing Sutcliffe's psychology, his methods of evasion, and the social conditions that allowed his crimes to persist for years. Peter Sutcliffe died in prison in 2020, ending a chapter of British criminal history that spanned decades. Yet the memory of the Yorkshire Ripper remains embedded in public consciousness, a chilling reminder of the capacity for calculated violence and the profound impact such crimes can have on communities. The story of Sutcliffe is not just one of murder, it is a narrative about societal vulnerability, the challenges of policing in an era without modern forensic technology, and the enduring human cost of a predator who lived among ordinary citizens, committing atrocities that left indelible marks on history. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 5. Fred West in the industrial city of Gloucester, England. A quiet street hid one of the most horrifying criminal sagas in British history. Behind the unassuming facade of 25 Cromwell Street, a man named Fred West, together with his wife Rosemary West, carried out a series of murders so cruel and methodical that the case shocked the United Kingdom and would haunt the nation for decades. Over a period spanning the late 1960s through the early 1980s, this couple created a house of horrors that combined sadistic violence, manipulation, and prolonged psychological terror. Fred West was born in 1941 in Herefordshire, England, into a family already steeped in dysfunction. From a young age, he exhibited signs of sexual deviancy, aggression, and a disturbing fascination with sadism. His adolescence was marked by petty crime, sexual offenses, and a deep disregard for societal norms. Neighbors and relatives described him as charming in public, but dangerously violent in private. By the time he married Rosemary Letts in the 1960s, Fred had already developed a pattern of criminal and abusive behavior that would later define the couple's reign of terror. Rosemary, born in 1953, was a vulnerable and impressionable young woman who fell under Fred's manipulative influence. Their relationship quickly turned controlling and abusive, with Fred asserting dominance through violence, intimidation, and psychological coercion. Over time, Rosemary became complicit in Fred's activities, participating in the selection, luring, and eventual murder of victims, though historians note that her level of involvement and complicity evolved over the years. The first known murder attributed to Fred West occurred in the mid-1960s when he strangled a young woman named Rita Goff, a local acquaintance. Fred's early victims were often young women he met through work, social connections, or by exploiting vulnerable individuals. His methods combined physical assault, psychological intimidation, and, in some cases, sexual abuse. By the late 1960s, Fred and Rosemary had begun using their home on Cromwell Street as a central location for their crimes. The house itself became an instrument of terror. Each room was a stage for Fred's sadistic impulses. Victims were lured under the pretense of friendship, work, or intimacy and were often held captive for extended periods. Many were tortured, sexually assaulted, and ultimately murdered within the confines of the property. In some cases, bodies were buried in the garden, hidden within the structure of the house, or disposed of in nearby rivers and canals. The couple's ability to conceal their crimes within their home was aided by the social isolation of the street and the lack of scrutiny from neighbors, who often assumed the Wests were simply a normal family. Fred and Rosemary's victims varied in age and background, but there was a consistent pattern of targeting young women who were vulnerable or unsuspecting. Over time, the couple's confidence grew, leading to increasingly bold crimes. They engaged in a disturbing cycle of grooming, coercion, and abuse, often involving the children in the household as witnesses to violence, which had long-term psychological effects on the family. Several accounts from former neighbors described the house as having a strange, oppressive atmosphere, with loud arguments, screams, and comings and goings at odd hours. Yet few suspected the horrors taking place behind closed doors. In 1971, the couple moved permanently to 25 Cromwell Street, a house with sufficient space to carry out their crimes with greater freedom. Over the next decade, the home became the epicenter of one of Britain's most chilling serial murder sprees. Victims were often kept for days, sometimes weeks, before being killed. Fred frequently recorded the abuse and took photographs, a habit that later became critical evidence during investigations. Rosemary's role expanded during this period. She actively participated in controlling victims, assisting in restraining them, and helping Fred carry out the murders. The psychological manipulation employed by Fred and Rosemary was extensive. Victims were isolated, threatened, and subjected to escalating violence designed to break their will. The couple's methods were premeditated, involving careful planning of lures, control mechanisms, and disposal strategies. In several instances, victims were buried within the walls of the house itself, a macabre strategy that delayed discovery for years. Children in the household were sometimes coerced into silence or complicit behavior, further highlighting the perverse family dynamics orchestrated by the Wests. The Wests' crimes continued unabated until 1987, when a combination of events led to exposure. One of their children, now an adult, reported the suspicions of abuse and unusual deaths to local authorities. Investigators began examining the house, uncovering human remains buried in the garden, concealed within walls, and hidden in other parts of the property. Over several months, police exhumed numerous bodies, ultimately identifying at least 12 confirmed victims, with suspicions of additional unreported murders extending the total closer to 20. During the investigation, evidence revealed a disturbing history of psychological abuse and domestic terror. Interviews with surviving children, neighbors, and acquaintances described the oppressive atmosphere of the household. The fear instilled by Fred, and the complicity or coerced participation of Rosemary. Forensic analysis provided incontrovertible links between the Wests and their victims, including fingerprints, clothing fibers, and other trace evidence. Photographs and diary entries found in the house detailed the crimes, providing chilling insight into the couple's motives and methods. The trial of Fred and Rosemary West, which began in 1994, captivated the nation. Courtrooms were filled with journalists, family members of victims, and citizens seeking answers. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Testimony from surviving witnesses, forensic reports, photographs, and the gruesome discovery of bodies hidden in the home prosecutors painted a portrait of two individuals consumed by sadistic desire, capable of premeditated, brutal violence over nearly 2 decades. Fred West confessed to several murders, though he often minimized his responsibility or rationalized his actions. Rosemary initially denied involvement but was later found guilty of multiple murders, based on her active participation and the corroborating evidence. The trial revealed that the West's crimes were not impulsive but part of a sustained pattern of abuse, manipulation, and deliberate killing. In 1995, Fred West committed suicide in prison before his appeal could be heard. Ending his life at the age of 53, Rosemary West was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, where she remains to this day. The Cromwell Street murders had a profound impact on British society. The case exposed the potential for extreme domestic violence and predatory behavior to occur behind seemingly ordinary. It prompted significant changes in police procedures, particularly regarding missing persons, domestic abuse reporting, and cross-referencing disappearances over long periods. Psychologists and criminologists have studied the Wests extensively to understand the dynamics of co-offending couples, particularly how a dominant partner can manipulate a subordinate partner into complicity in extreme crimes. Even decades later, the story of Fred and Rosemary West continues to evoke horror. The house at Cromwell Street, demolished shortly after the investigation, remains a symbol of unspeakable cruelty. Books, documentaries, and true crime analyses revisit the events, examining both the psychological profiles of the killers and the systemic failures that allowed their crimes to persist undetected for years. Fred West's life of violence, combined with Rosemary West's complicity, serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist behind ordinary appearances. Their actions destroyed families, traumatized a community, and left an indelible mark on the history of British crime. The tale of Cromwell Street is more than a record of murders. It is a study in human depravity, manipulation, and the horrifying potential of co-conspiratorial evil. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 6. Colin, Ireland. In the early 1990s, London's gay community faced an unseen predator who would come to be known as the Gay Slayer. Colin, Ireland embarked on a killing spree that targeted gay men across the city, blending meticulous planning, psychological manipulation, and lethal violence. His crimes were deliberate, calculated, and terrifying in their precision, leaving both law enforcement and the public stunned by his audacity. Colin, Ireland was born in 1954 in London. From a young age, he exhibited signs of social maladjustment and a preoccupation with control and domination. Reports from his early life describe a boy who struggled with relationships and authority, cultivating fantasies of power and revenge that grew increasingly disturbing as he matured. By the 1980s, Ireland had begun to engage in criminal activity, often minor offences, but these foreshadowed the escalation to violent predation that would define his later years. The first known murder attributed to Ireland occurred in 1993, using personal ads in gay magazines. He meticulously selected his victims, choosing men who were socially isolated or vulnerable. He presented himself as charming and trustworthy, crafting an image of a friendly companion to lure victims into his trap. Once he gained their confidence, he would isolate them and commit murder, typically by strangulation, an act that allowed him both control and concealment. Ireland's spree was both systematic and cruel. He often visited victims in their own homes or in locations where they felt safe, exploiting trust to execute his attacks. After killing his victims, he sometimes staged the scene to avoid immediate detection. Despite the careful planning, his actions caused widespread fear within London's gay community, which began to notice a disturbing pattern of disappearances and unexplained deaths among its members. Police investigations were initially fragmented, as the killings occurred across multiple boroughs. Witness accounts and forensic evidence were limited, allowing Ireland to operate without immediate apprehension. His ability to blend into urban life, combined with his strategic selection of victims, extended the duration of his spree. He killed a total of 5 men over several months in 1993, each murder carrying its own chilling narrative of manipulation and control. One defining characteristic of Ireland's method was his ability to mimic normalcy. Two neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances, he appeared ordinary, polite, and unremarkable. This duality, an outwardly normal individual hiding a predatory interior, allowed him to evade suspicion for months. Investigators later noted that his calm demeanor and intelligence were key factors in his ability to select victims and plan killings without arousing attention. The police breakthrough came when patterns emerged linking the disappearances. Investigators cross-referenced victims' routines, last known contacts, and locations, gradually narrowing the suspect pool. Surveillance and forensic analysis led authorities to Colin Ireland, who was arrested in 1993. Upon questioning, Ireland confessed to all 5 murders, offering detailed accounts of the selection, manipulation, and killing of his victims. His lack of remorse and clinical description of the murders shocked detectives and the public alike. The trial of Colin Ireland began in 1993 and drew intense media coverage. Evidence included forensic links, victim testimonies prior to their deaths, and Ireland's own confessions. Prosecutors presented Ireland as a calculating, manipulative killer, motivated by a desire for power and control. Ireland's psychological profile revealed sadistic tendencies, antisocial personality traits, and an obsessive focus on domination over his victims. Despite his ability to appear normal in everyday life, the court recognized his actions as premeditated, deliberate, and exceptionally cruel. Ireland was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he never be released. His crimes highlighted vulnerabilities within marginalized communities, particularly regarding personal safety, trust, and law enforcement attention. The case also underscored the importance of cross-jurisdictional coordination in detecting patterns among serial offenses. Colin Ireland remained in prison until his death in 2012. His legacy as the gay slayer, a chilling reminder of predation masked by normalcy. The social and psychological impact of his crimes reverberated through London's LGBTQ+ community, prompting increased awareness, safety measures, and community vigilance. Researchers and criminologists have since studied Ireland's behavior to understand the dynamics of targeted serial killing, the exploitation of social trust, and the psychological profile of a methodical predator. The story of Colin Ireland is more than a record of murder. It is a narrative about the dangers of manipulation, the calculated selection of vulnerable individuals, and the terrifying capacity of some individuals to hide extreme cruelty behind a facade of ordinary life. His killings left permanent scars on families, communities, and society's understanding of serial predation, solidifying his place among the most notorious British serial killers of the late 20th century. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.